My name is Julia. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've worked in roles that reward consistency more than charisma. I've been a project lead, a mentor, the person people come to when something quietly needs fixing. Not the loudest voice in the room, not the one who takes up space, just dependable. If you met me in a meeting, you might think I was cautious, maybe even passive. I tend to listen more than I speak. I take notes. I don't interrupt. People often assume that means I'm comfortable where I am or that I don't want more. That assumption has followed me for years, and for a long time, I didn't correct it. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about exposing villains or delivering a dramatic takedown. It's about something slower and honestly more unsettling. How easy it can be to be replaced when people mistake your steadiness for stagnation, and how systems make decisions long before they admit them out loud. I was asked to mentor a temporary hire. That was the official language. He was positioned as short-term support, someone I would help on board, guide through processes, and introduce to stakeholders. I did what I'd always done. I documented. I explained context. I made sure he didn't fail. What I didn't know, what no one thought to tell me, was that the transition plan was dated before he arrived. This story follows the emotional arc of realizing that your value has been quietly reassigned, that the narrative around your role has shifted without your consent, and that the rules you thought everyone was playing by were never the real ones. It's about the small moments that don't look like betrayal when they happen. The comments that feel off, but easy to dismiss. The silence that starts to sound intentional. I want to be clear about something up front. I didn't handle everything perfectly. I stayed quiet longer than I should have. I explained away things that deserve scrutiny, and I don't share this to position myself as a hero or a victim, but as someone who learned, slowly, how power actually moves in professional spaces. There are no shouting matches in this story, no public scenes, no satisfying moment where someone gets humiliated. What there is instead is clarity. The kind that arrives too late to save what you thought you had, but early enough to shape who you become next. If you've ever been the reliable one, the person who holds things together while others get positioned, this story may feel uncomfortably familiar. Not because our circumstances will match exactly, but because the emotional pattern might. I'm telling this honestly, without exaggeration, because I think we don't talk enough about quiet displacement, about what it feels like to realize you were being transitioned out of your own life, one reasonable step at a time. Before we begin, let me ask you something gently. Have you ever sensed something was changing around you, long before anyone admitted it out loud? Before any of this happened, I was known as the safe pair of hands. That phrase came up often, sometimes directly, sometimes in tone. If a project was behind, I was looped in. If a stakeholder was frustrated, I was asked to smooth it over. If a system needed to be rebuilt without drama, I was assigned quietly, usually without ceremony. I didn't mind. At least, I told myself I didn't. In meetings, I sat slightly back from the table. Not disengaged, just observant. I was the person who remembered why a decision had been made 2 years earlier, who could trace a process from its messy beginning to its polished present. People trusted me. They just didn't see me. And there's a difference between those two things that I didn't fully understand yet. I wasn't invisible in the sense of being ignored. I was invisible in a more specific way. My presence was assumed. My continuity was taken for granted. When leaders spoke about the team, my name wasn't mentioned because, in their minds, I was already folded into the infrastructure. Like a load-bearing wall you stop noticing once the building stands. New hires were introduced with excitement. Promotions were announced with language about growth and potential. My role was described with words like stable, consistent, reliable. Compliments, technically, but static ones. I had been at the company long enough to watch cycles repeat. Initiatives launched with enthusiasm, then quietly abandoned. Executives rotated, priorities rebranded. Through all of it, I stayed. I adapted. I absorbed institutional memory so others didn't have to carry it. That became my function. When people describe me to others, it was usually in practical terms. Julia knows how that works. Ask Julia, she's been here forever. She'll make sure it gets done. No one ever said Julia should be in the room for this decision. No one said Julia should be leading this. And again, I didn't protest. I told myself influence didn't need a title. That proximity to execution mattered more than optics. That being indispensable was its own protection. Looking back, that belief was both true and dangerously incomplete. I trained people constantly. New managers, external consultants, temporary staff. I enjoyed the clarity of teaching, breaking complex systems into logic that made sense. I never withheld information. I believed transparency created stability. What I didn't notice at first was how often knowledge flowed out of me without anything flowing back. I wasn't asked about my long-term goals, not because anyone was hostile, simply because no one thought to ask. My career trajectory was assumed to be flat, not because I lacked ability, but because I didn't disrupt. There's a particular kind of underestimation that feels polite. It doesn't insult you, it thanks you, it praises your work ethic, and then it quietly moves past you. That was the space I occupied. So when my manager scheduled a one-on-one and mentioned we'd be bringing in a temporary hire to support capacity, I didn't feel threatened. I felt relieved. I was overloaded. I welcomed help. I even suggested that I mentor him directly so onboarding would be smooth. That suggestion would later matter more than I realized. At that point, I still believed my value was obvious, that my history spoke for itself, that if something were changing, someone would tell me. I didn't yet understand that in some organizations, change is planned in silence and announced only when it's irreversible. Back then, I thought I knew who I was to them. I was wrong. The first moment didn't announce itself. There was no dramatic email, no meeting invite that made my stomach drop. It was smaller than that. So small, I almost missed it entirely. His name was Mark. That's what I'll call him here, because the name itself isn't important. What matters is how he arrived. Politely, quietly, framed as temporary, contract-based, 90 days with the possibility of extension depending on needs. Those words matter too. On his first day, I was asked to walk him through our core workflows. Not unusual. I'd done it dozens of times. I prepared a clean onboarding document, highlighted the systems he'd need access to, and scheduled time to explain context. Not just what we did, but why. He listened carefully, took notes, asked the right questions. I remember thinking he was competent, maybe even promising. That thought didn't scare me. At that point, it still felt like a shared space. The first small cut came during a standing team meeting 2 weeks later. We were reviewing a process update, one I had designed months earlier after a long compliance review. Mark referenced it while speaking. That wasn't the issue. The issue was the phrasing. He said, "So what I've been implementing here is a streamlined version of the approval flow." I waited for the natural pause where someone would clarify, or where he might add, based on Julia's existing framework. No one did. The meeting moved on. It wasn't a lie, exactly. He had been implementing it. But the structure, the reasoning, the trade-offs, those hadn't come from him. They'd come from me, from weeks of work that predated his arrival. I told myself it didn't matter. That credit wasn't the point, that the work speaking for itself was enough. Still, I wrote it down that night in my notebook. Not emotionally, just factually. Team meeting, process update attributed ambiguously. I didn't know why I felt the need to note it. I just did. The second moment came in an email thread. A senior leader asked a question about scalability risks. Before I could respond, Mark replied, quickly, confidently, using language I recognized. Almost verbatim phrasing from a document I had shared with him the week before. Again, no one corrected it. No one looped me in. This time I hesitated before telling myself it was nothing, because there was a pattern beginning to form, not of malice, but of momentum. He was being seen as the interface to the work. I was becoming the background system that fed it. The smallest cut, though, the one that stayed with me, happened in a hallway conversation I wasn't meant to overhear. Two managers were talking about bandwidth. One said, "Mark's been really proactive. He's basically running that stream now." Running it. Not supporting, not learning, running. I stood there for a second longer than necessary, unseen, listening. Then I walked away without interrupting. That was the moment something shifted internally. Not anger, not fear, but awareness. I replayed the past few weeks in my head, the subtle repositioning, the way questions were starting to go to him first, the way I was still doing the work but no longer narrating it. What unsettled me wasn't that he was capable. It was that the organization seemed eager to reassign authorship without discussion. Still, I said nothing. I rationalized it the way many of us do. He's new. They're excited. He needs visibility to succeed. This will balance out. But once you notice a cut, however small, you can't unsee the blade. From that point on, I paid closer attention, not emotionally, but structurally. Who was invited? Who was deferred to? Who summarized decisions at the end of meetings? And slowly, quietly, I realized I was no longer the narrator of my own work. I was becoming a footnote, still essential, still present, but no longer named. And no one seemed to think that required a conversation. Once you notice a pattern, the real danger isn't the pattern itself. It's how quickly you can adapt to it. At first, every small dismissal registered sharply. A meeting invite that excluded me. A decision summary sent without my input. Mark being asked questions I had answered for years. Each moment landed, lingered, then faded under the weight of explanation. I became very good at explaining things away. I told myself this was what collaboration looked like. That leadership wanted a single point of contact, and he was simply more visible right now. That my role was evolving, not shrinking. That being above the fray was a sign of trust. The language I used internally was calm, reasonable, mature. Dangerously so, because once you normalize disrespect, you stop reacting to it. And when you stop reacting, others stop noticing it altogether. Mark didn't do anything overt. That was part of what made it hard to name. He never interrupted me. Never spoke over me. In fact, he often deferred politely in one-on-one conversations, thanked me for my guidance, asked for my opinion privately. Publicly, though, the center of gravity kept shifting. In meetings, he'd answer first. In emails, he'd summarize outcomes. When leadership asked for updates, his name was the one attached to the thread. I noticed that when I spoke, people listened, but they no longer looked at me for direction. They looked at him. Still, I stayed composed. I told myself that visibility was overrated, that substance always outlasted optics, that my work ethic would speak louder than positioning. What I didn't fully accept yet was that organizations don't reward effort. They reward narrative. And the narrative was quietly being rewritten. I remember one particular week when 3 things happened in succession. First, a process document I had authored was circulated with minor edits and Mark's name in the header. No one had asked me to review the changes. No one had mentioned the rename. It was subtle, almost administrative, but unmistakable. Second, my manager rescheduled our one-on-one, twice. Each time with a brief apology, each time with no follow-up questions about how things were going. Third, a senior stakeholder thanked Mark in a group message for stepping up and taking ownership. Ownership. That word stayed with me because I hadn't stepped down. I hadn't relinquished anything. I was still doing the work, often correcting things quietly after hours, ensuring nothing broke. But ownership, it seemed, was no longer defined by labor. It was defined by presence. I considered saying something, rehearsed sentences in my head that sounded calm, professional, non-accusatory. I just want to clarify roles. I've noticed some overlap. I want to make sure expectations are aligned. Each version felt reasonable. Each one also felt like it would mark me as insecure, territorial, difficult, and I had spent years cultivating the opposite reputation. So instead I stayed quiet and refined my usefulness. I made sure nothing failed. I answered questions promptly. I kept my tone neutral, helpful, unthreatening. If someone overlooked me, I adjusted rather than corrected. This is how disrespect becomes normalized, not through cruelty, but through accommodation. The more I absorbed, the easier it became for others to forget where the work originated. Not because they were malicious, but because I made it convenient. There was a moment, small, almost forgettable, when Mark said to me, "You're so calm about all of this. I'd be stressed." I smiled and said something non-committal. What I didn't say was that calm had become a strategy for survival, that I was trying to stay legible in a system that valued composure over truth. Inside, though, something was eroding. Not confidence, clarity. I was losing sight of where my responsibility ended and his began, where support crossed into replacement, where patience crossed into permission. And the longer I waited to name it, the more permanent it began to feel. By the end of that month, the shift no longer felt temporary. It felt structural, and I realized, with a quiet kind of dread, that if I didn't redefine my role, someone else already had. The role wasn't given to me in writing. No one sat me down and explained it. No updated job description arrived in my inbox. There was no explicit conversation where someone said, "This is who you are now." Instead, the role revealed itself through expectation. I was expected to be available, but not central. Informed, but not consulted. Reliable, but not directional. I started to see it in how people approached me. When something broke, they came to me quietly. "Can you take a look?" When something succeeded, they spoke to Mark. When decisions were made, I was looped in afterward, often with the assumption that I would help implement, not question. I had become the stabilizer. Every system has one. The person who absorbs ambiguity so others can move fast. The one who smooths edges, fills gaps, makes transitions look effortless. It's a valuable role, but it's also a dangerous one, because once you're cast in it, you stop being seen as someone who needs anything in return. I realized this most clearly during a planning session I was invited to just to listen in. That phrase, "just to listen," should have registered as a warning. At the time, I treated it as courtesy. I took notes, observed, waited for a moment to contribute. That moment never came. The conversation was about future state ownership, about scaling, about who would lead which streams moving forward. Mark's name was mentioned multiple times. Mine wasn't. Not once. I remember sitting there, pen still, listening to people talk about work I had built as though it were a neutral asset, detached from its creator. And in that silence, something crystallized. They didn't see me as someone to be transitioned with. They saw me as someone to be transitioned through. I was the bridge, useful until crossed. After that meeting, the expectations became clearer. I was asked to document more, to capture context, to ensure continuity. Words that sound respectful, even flattering, until you realize they are all about preservation, not progression. No one asked what I wanted next. No one asked if I saw myself leading differently, or expanding, or stepping into something new. My future had been quietly collapsed into maintenance. I didn't feel angry, I felt categorized. And the most unsettling part was how neatly I fit the category, because I had trained people to see me this way. I had reinforced it with my behavior. My calm, my adaptability, my refusal to disrupt. There's a particular kind of role that looks like trust, but functions like containment. You're close enough to know everything, but far enough from power to change it. That was where I was placed. Mark, on the other hand, was being positioned as dynamic, forward-facing, the one who owned the narrative. He asked questions publicly, framed problems aloud, took up space, not aggressively, just confidently. I noticed how leadership responded to that, how they leaned in, how they built ideas around his presence. Meanwhile, I was expected to keep things running smoothly in the background, without needing acknowledgement, support, or reassurance. And again, I didn't protest, partly because I was still trying to be fair, partly because I didn't yet know what I wanted instead, but mostly because I hadn't accepted the full implication of the role I'd been assigned. Once you're seen as invisible infrastructure, advocating for yourself feels like a breach of character, like you're violating the unspoken agreement. So I stayed within the lines. I fulfilled the role. And in doing so, I unknowingly made it easier for the next phase to happen. Because roles once assigned tend to harden, and mine was no longer negotiable, unless I was willing to become someone they didn't recognize. The shift didn't happen during a meeting. There was no argument, no raised voice, no email that forced a reckoning. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, in the quiet space between tasks, when nothing was demanding my attention, and I had just enough mental room to notice what I had been avoiding. I was reviewing a shared roadmap document, one of many. It had been updated recently, and I was scanning it the way I always did, looking for inconsistencies, dependencies, anything that might cause trouble later. That's when I noticed the date. At the top of the document, in small gray text, was a line I had never paid attention to before. Initial transition plan. Drafted Q2. Q2. Mark had joined in Q3. I stared at that line longer than necessary. Then I scrolled. Slowly. Carefully. The document wasn't new. It had been living quietly in our system for months. Long before the temporary hire. Long before the conversations about support and capacity. long before I had been asked to mentor anyone. The plan was detailed, thoughtful, calmly written. It outlined a phased handover of responsibilities, a gradual repositioning of ownership, a timeline that matched, almost perfectly, what I had been experiencing. This wasn't improvisation. This was execution. I didn't feel panic. What I felt was something colder and clearer. Relief, because suddenly the confusion made sense. The missed meetings, the renamed documents, the way no one corrected misattribution, the way conversations about the future happened around me, not with me. None of it was personal, and none of it was accidental. I closed the document and sat back in my chair. For a long time, I had been asking myself the wrong questions. Why is this happening? Did I do something wrong? Should I speak up? That afternoon, a different question formed. What am I actually part of right now? The answer was uncomfortable but undeniable. I wasn't being evaluated. I wasn't being sidelined because of a recent failure. I wasn't being quietly punished. I was being transitioned out, with courtesy. And courtesy, I realized, can be more dangerous than cruelty. Because it doesn't trigger alarm. It invites cooperation. I thought back to the moment I had volunteered to mentor Mark. How reasonable it had felt. How aligned with my values. How it had positioned me as helpful, collaborative, essential to the process. I saw now how perfectly that fit the plan. They didn't need to push me out. They needed me to participate. The shift inside me wasn't dramatic. It was subtle but irreversible. I stopped asking whether things would balance out. I stopped assuming someone would clarify eventually. I stopped believing that patience would be rewarded. Instead, I began to observe with intention, not to accuse, not to confront, just to understand the full shape of what was happening. I reopened my notebook that evening and reread the entries I had been making almost absent-mindedly. Dates, phrases, small moments I hadn't trusted myself to interpret at the time. Together, they formed a clean line. What struck me most was not that the plan existed, but that no one had thought it necessary to tell me. They had trusted me to be professional, to be adaptable, to do the right thing for the organization, and I had. But professionalism without agency is just compliance with better posture. That day, something hardened, not in bitterness, but in resolve. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't mention the document. I didn't change my behavior outwardly. What changed was internal. I stopped offering more than was asked. I stopped filling in gaps before they were visible. I stopped assuming responsibility for outcomes I didn't control. Silence, for the first time, felt like a choice. And in that choice, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Alignment, not with the organization, but with myself. I went home that night knowing one thing with certainty. Whatever happened next, I would not be surprised by it. Once you understand the shape of a situation, silence changes its meaning. Before, my quiet had been habitual, reflexive, a byproduct of professionalism and restraint. Now it was deliberate, measured, strategic. I didn't announce this shift to anyone. Outwardly, I looked the same. I attended the same meetings, answered questions when asked, met deadlines. Nothing about my performance changed. What changed was what I stopped doing. I stopped anticipating needs. That was the first and hardest adjustment. For years, I had built my value on seeing problems before they surfaced, closing gaps invisibly so others could move faster. It felt almost irresponsible to stop, but I forced myself to wait. If something wasn't in my scope, I didn't quietly take it on. If a document was incomplete, I didn't finish it unless asked. If a decision lacked context, I didn't volunteer it preemptively. At first, nothing happened. The system kept moving, carried by momentum and assumption. People were still comfortable, still confident. That's the thing about infrastructure. You don't notice it's missing until strain appears. I also changed how I spoke. When asked for input, I was precise and minimal. I answered the question exactly as it was framed. No more, no less. I stopped narrating implications, stopped offering future-proofing unless it was explicitly requested. This wasn't passive-aggressive, it was accurate. I realized how often I had been providing insurance, absorbing risk on behalf of others without acknowledgement. Now, I let that risk surface naturally. Mark, meanwhile, continued to occupy the visible role. He didn't notice my shift. Why would he? From his perspective, I was still helpful, still responsive, still calm. Leadership didn't notice either. They were seeing what they expected to see, continuity. What they didn't see was how much of that continuity had been quietly dependent on me. There was a moment, a subtle one, when a project update stalled. Not catastrophically, just enough to create friction. A decision looped for days instead of hours. A stakeholder asked for clarification that hadn't been anticipated. I watched this happen with a kind of clinical interest. No satisfaction, no relief, just data. The silence I had chosen created space. And in that space, assumptions began to wobble. Still, no one came to me directly. That told me something important. If my absence from the problem-solving layer didn't immediately trigger concern, it meant my role had already been conceptually removed from that layer. I was no longer central, even in absence. That realization was sobering. It forced me to confront a truth I had been avoiding. If I wanted to change the outcome, visibility alone wouldn't be enough. I couldn't simply speak up and expect recalibration. The structure had moved past that point. Silence, then, wasn't about waiting to be noticed. It was about seeing clearly. I began to document differently, not to prove anything, not to build a case, just to understand dependencies, who relied on what, which decisions required historical knowledge, where informal authority actually lived. I noticed how often Mark deferred privately but asserted publicly, how often leadership trusted summaries over substance, how rarely anyone traced outcomes back to origin. None of this made anyone bad. It made the system efficient. And efficiency, I was learning, often comes at the expense of fairness. Choosing silence didn't make me invisible. It revealed how invisible I already was. And strangely, that was freeing. Because once you stop trying to be seen by people who have already decided where you belong, you reclaim energy. Attention sharpens. Emotion settles. I wasn't angry. I wasn't plotting. I wasn't waiting for vindication. I was preparing, not for confrontation, but for transition. Not theirs. Mine. By the end of that period, I understood something fundamental. Silence isn't weakness when it's chosen. It's clarity without noise. And clarity was exactly what I needed for what came next. Preparation doesn't always look like action. Most of the time it looks like stillness. Quiet observation layered over routine. Patience layered over habit. From the outside, nothing about me appeared different. Internally, though, I had begun to map the system with a level of precision I hadn't needed before. What they never noticed was how much of the organization lived between formal structures. Processes were documented, yes. Ownership was assigned, on paper. But the real movement, the real continuity, happened in handoffs, in memory, in judgment calls no dashboard ever captured. That was where I lived. And because I had lived there for so long, I could finally see it clearly. I started by revisiting old projects. Not nostalgically, analytically. I traced how decisions had been made when things went wrong. Who had been consulted informally? Whose approval had actually mattered versus whose name appeared on the slide. Patterns emerged quickly. There were at least 3 major workflows that appeared self-sustaining, but weren't. They relied on historical context that had never been fully documented. Context I carried, not because I had hoarded it, but because no one had ever asked me to extract it. I also noticed how often I was the final checkpoint without being labeled as such. People would send something just to sanity check, unaware that those checks were the reason issues hadn't escalated. I stopped doing those quietly. Instead, when asked, I responded with questions. What's the decision path here? Who's accountable if this shifts? Is this aligned with the earlier exception we made? Not confrontational, just clarifying. Each question slowed things down slightly. Introduced friction. Required others to engage with complexity they hadn't realized they were outsourcing. At the same time, I began organizing my own records. Not in a defensive way, in a narrative way. I reviewed timelines, meeting notes, decision logs. I aligned dates with outcomes, not to assign blame, but to understand causality. What decisions led to resilience? Which led to fragility? What became clear was that I hadn't just been executing work. I had been shaping risk. That realization changed how I saw myself. I wasn't a background contributor. I was a stabilizing agent. And stabilizing agents, when removed, don't cause immediate collapse. They cause delayed failure. I noticed how Mark's role depended heavily on clean inputs, how visible leadership relied on summaries that assumed underlying coherence, how little tolerance there was for ambiguity once speed became the priority. No one noticed that I had stopped smoothing transitions. They noticed outcomes, but not the absence that created them. And because nothing broke outright, there was no alarm. That's the danger of quiet competence. When it's gone, the system doesn't scream, it drifts. During this time, I also paid attention to language, how people spoke about the future, how often they used phrases like post-transition or once this is fully handed over, how rarely anyone used my name in those sentences. I didn't correct them. Instead, I prepared myself emotionally for what that implied. I stopped identifying my worth with my role, stopped anchoring my identity to being needed. That detachment wasn't easy. It felt at first like grief, but grief has a way of sharpening focus. I also began to imagine alternatives, not impulsively, but realistically. What would it look like to step out of this structure entirely? What skills did I have that weren't being used here? What leverage existed outside the frame they'd placed me in? Those questions didn't lead to immediate answers, but they shifted my orientation. I was no longer trying to preserve a position. I was preparing to reclaim authorship. What they never noticed, because they weren't looking, was that the person they thought they were transitioning out was no longer invested in staying. And that changed everything, because when you stop trying to hold your place in a system, you start to see where it's brittle. And brittleness, once seen, can't be unseen. By the time anyone sensed that something was off, it was already too late to reverse. Not because I had acted against them, but because I had finally stopped acting for them. The reveal wasn't dramatic. There was no email that changed everything, no confrontation, no moment where I leaned back and thought, now I've got them. It happened quietly, in the way truth often does, when enough pieces line up that denial is no longer possible. I was reviewing access permissions for a routine audit, something I'd done many times before. As I clicked through folders and shared drives, I noticed a pattern that hadn't stood out until then. Mark had access to almost everything. Almost. There were legacy systems, older integrations, exception logs, external vendor agreements that still ran through me. Not because anyone had intentionally restricted access, but because those systems predated most restructures. They were held together by informal knowledge and long memory. Mine. That alone wasn't the reveal. The reveal came when I realized something more precise. Those systems weren't just operational. They were governance critical. They contained historical decisions that explained why certain shortcuts were allowed, why specific risks were tolerated, why some processes couldn't simply be optimized without consequence. And none of that context lived anywhere else. I had assumed, naively, that this knowledge would eventually be extracted, formalized, transferred, that someone would ask me to document it fully, to train someone intentionally, to acknowledge the dependency. No one had. Not because it wasn't valuable, but because it was invisible. That's when the leverage became clear, not as power over others, but as clarity about my own position. I wasn't replaceable in the way they thought. I was untranslated. The organization had mistaken access for understanding, presence for ownership, documentation for comprehension, and Mark, competent as he was, had been positioned as a proxy without being given the full map. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt calm, because leverage that arrives without intent isn't something you celebrate. It's something you respect. I also realized something else in that moment. I had choices. I could surface this gap immediately, frame it as a risk, offer to lead a formal knowledge transfer, reinforce my indispensability and hope that visibility would translate into security. Or I could do nothing, let the system continue as designed, let the transition complete on paper, let the absence of depth reveal itself naturally, without accusation, without intervention. Neither option was cruel, neither was vindictive, but only one was honest. I'd already seen the transition plan. I'd already been excluded from future state conversations. The decision about my trajectory had been made without me. At that point, advocating for myself inside that structure would have required pretending the plan didn't exist, and I couldn't unsee it. The private reveal wasn't just about leverage. It was about consent. I realized I had been cooperating with a process that no longer included my agency, and continuing to do so would mean accepting an outcome I hadn't chosen. So I chose clarity instead. I didn't lock anyone out, didn't withhold information maliciously, didn't sabotage anything. I simply maintained boundaries. I documented what I was formally responsible for. I stopped translating tacit knowledge into shortcuts. I responded to requests accurately, not expansively. And I watched. Slowly, questions began to surface. Small ones at first. Why does this exception exist? Who approved this originally? Is this documented somewhere? I answered honestly. I'd have to check historical context. That predates the current structure. It was handled informally at the time. No blame, no drama, just facts. What struck me most was how uncomfortable uncertainty made people, how quickly they reached for reassurance, how often they assumed someone else must know. That someone for a long time had been me. The private reveal then wasn't a single discovery. It was a reframing. I stopped seeing myself as someone being edged out. I saw myself as someone who had already outgrown the frame they were trying to place me in. And once that happened, the fear disappeared. Because when you understand your true leverage, you no longer need to assert it. You just need to decide what you're willing to carry forward and what you're willing to leave behind. Every situation like this eventually narrows. At first, there are many paths, small adjustments, conversations you could initiate, patience you could extend. But once clarity arrives, those paths begin to close. Not because you're forced, but because you're no longer willing to lie to yourself about what each option actually costs. I was at that point. I remember sitting at my desk late one evening, the office mostly empty, lights dimmed automatically by the building system. I wasn't working. I was thinking. I laid the options out plainly, without emotion. Option 1, speak up now. Request a formal conversation. Acknowledge the transition plan. Ask where I fit. Advocate for a revised role, clearer authority, recognition of my actual contribution. This option looked mature on the surface. Professional. Reasonable. But when I followed it to its likely conclusion, I saw the problem. Even if leadership listened, even if they expressed surprise or regret, the structure was already in motion. Mark had been positioned, expectations had been set. Reversing that wouldn't be clean. At best, I would become a complication, a risk, someone whose presence disrupted a plan that leadership had already aligned around. I might gain temporary reassurance, but I would lose something more important: credibility, as someone who understood how the system really worked. Option 2, double down on indispensability. Surface the gaps. Highlight the risk. Make it clear, subtly, that things didn't function without me. This option was tempting in a quiet way. It promised leverage without confrontation, but it also required me to stay, to continue propping up a structure that had already decided my future, to be necessary but not chosen, valued, but only under the condition that I never asked for more. That wasn't power. That was containment. Option 3, step back, fully. Not emotionally, not dramatically, structurally. Let the transition complete. Let the system discover its own limits. Accept that my chapter here was ending, not because I failed, but because the role available to me no longer matched who I was. This option didn't offer validation, or closure, or even fairness. What it offered was alignment. Once I saw that, the decision stopped feeling heavy. It felt inevitable. The irreversible part wasn't an action. It was a choice of orientation. I stopped preparing arguments, stopped imagining alternative outcomes, stopped hoping someone would suddenly see what they had missed. Instead, I began to prepare myself. Not in secret, not defensively, just honestly. I updated my records, clarified my responsibilities, ensured that what I owned was clean, accurate, and complete, not to protect the organization, but to leave my own work intact. I also began to disengage emotionally from the narrative around Mark. His success or failure was no longer relevant to my sense of self. He was part of a system doing what systems do. So was I. The most surprising part of the decision point was the calm that followed. Once I accepted that I wouldn't intervene to save a place that no longer existed for me, the tension dissolved. I slept better, thought more clearly, spoke with more precision. People noticed the calm, but misread it. They assumed I was fine with how things were unfolding, that I was comfortable stepping back, that my silence meant consent. In reality, my silence meant something else entirely. It meant I had already chosen. And once that choice was made, everything that followed was simply execution. Not of a plan against anyone, but of a boundary for myself. The point of no return isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quiet moment when you stop asking how to fix this and start asking, what do I want to carry forward from who I've been? That was the moment I crossed. And after that, there was no going back. Once a decision is made internally, movement doesn't need witnesses. From the outside, nothing changed. I still showed up, still delivered, still responded when asked. If anything, I appeared lighter, less tense, more composed. People read that as acceptance. They were wrong. What I was doing instead was narrowing my actions to what was formerly mine and quietly preparing for separation in ways no one had reason to monitor. I started with clarity. I reviewed my employment agreement, not looking for loopholes, just understanding terms. Notice periods, intellectual property language, non-compete clauses, the things you skim when you're hired and only truly read when you're leaving. Nothing dramatic stood out, but reading it grounded me. It reminded me that this was a professional relationship, not a moral contract. Next, I cleaned my work. Not erased, not stripped, cleaned. Every document I owned was accurate, current, and properly attributed. I removed ambiguity where it existed. If something depended on historical context, I noted that dependency without interpretation. I didn't consolidate undocumented knowledge. I didn't translate it into shortcuts. I simply ensured that what was written was true, and what wasn't written was clearly absent. That distinction mattered. I also stopped being the connective tissue. When someone asked, "Who should handle this?" I answered honestly, even when the answer wasn't me. That sits with Mark now. That decision is with leadership. I'm not the right owner for that anymore. Each response was calm, neutral, and emotional, and each one shifted weight. At the same time, I began quiet conversations outside the organization. Not interviews, not announcements, just reconnections, former colleagues, people who knew my work beyond my title, conversations about how things had changed in the industry, about where depth was undervalued and where it still mattered. These conversations weren't desperate, they were exploratory, and they reminded me of something I had forgotten. I wasn't defined by this one system. Inside the company, movement continued. Mark was increasingly positioned as the lead. Meetings he attended without me became standard. I was no longer surprised by that. I was tracking it. What surprised me was how little resistance there was to my gradual withdrawal from the informal layer. No one asked why I wasn't preempting issues anymore. No one asked why certain decisions took longer. The system absorbed the friction quietly. That told me something important. They had already accepted a version of reality where I was no longer central. So I stopped cushioning the transition. I didn't accelerate it. I didn't sabotage it. I simply stopped compensating for its blind spots. That's what moving in silence really looks like. Not secrecy, but restraint. I also paid attention to timing. Transitions have windows. Moments when questions are still allowed. Moments when they're not. I waited until I felt the window close. It happened during a quarterly review when leadership spoke about the new structure as a settled fact. When my name wasn't mentioned at all, not even in passing. I didn't feel hurt. I felt released. After that, my actions became simpler. I declined meetings that didn't require my presence. I redirected decisions that no longer belonged to me. I stopped volunteering for future planning. No one objected. That was the final confirmation. When you move in silence, the goal isn't to surprise anyone. It's to avoid unnecessary noise while you align your exit with your values. I wasn't leaving in anger. I wasn't making a point. I was concluding a chapter cleanly, on my terms, even if they never realized it. By the time consequences began to surface, the structure that depended on me had already shifted enough that my absence would feel confusing, not catastrophic, just unexplained. And that was exactly what I needed. The consequences didn't arrive as a single event. They arrived as a series of small disruptions, barely noticeable on their own, but cumulative in a way that changed the tone of the room. At first it was timing. Decisions that used to resolve within a day began to stretch into a week. Threads went quiet. Questions circled without landing. No one panicked. They simply adjusted expectations. Then it was confidence. Mark still spoke with certainty, but the certainty had a different texture. He began to qualify statements more often, to pause mid-sentence, to say things like, "I'll need to confirm," or "I want to double-check the history there." Those phrases weren't mistakes. They were signals. I noticed leadership responding differently too. Not critically, just cautiously. Follow-up questions increased. Requests for documentation became more specific. The tone shifted from assumption to verification. Still, no one connected this to me. Why would they? From their perspective, the transition was complete. I was still present, still helpful, still professional. There was no obvious absence to point to. What they were feeling wasn't loss. It was friction, and friction is harder to diagnose than failure. A vendor raised a concern about an old exception clause. No one could immediately explain why it existed. a compliance review flagged a dependency that wasn't documented anywhere obvious. A system change created a ripple effect no one had anticipated. None of these issues were severe, but they required time, attention, care, things I had quietly provided for years. I was asked about one of them eventually, in passing, during a check-in. "Do you remember why this was set up this way?" my manager asked casually. I answered honestly. "Yes. It was a workaround approved during the migration 3 years ago. We agreed not to formalize it because the upstream system was scheduled for replacement." There was a pause. "Oh," she said. "Do we have that written down somewhere?" "No," I replied. "It was handled verbally at the time." That was it. No accusation, no follow-up, just a note taken. Moments like that accumulated. I could see people recalibrating, not dramatically, but perceptibly. They were working harder to achieve the same level of stability, asking more questions, scheduling more meetings. The system was compensating, and that compensation had a cost. What struck me most was how impersonal it all felt. No one seemed angry, no one blamed anyone. They were simply responding to new constraints. That's when I understood something crucial. Organizations don't mourn individuals. They adjust to absences, and the adjustment phase is where truth emerges. Not about intent, but about impact. I also noticed how people began to reference the old way without naming me. Before, this used to be faster. We didn't used to need this many sign-offs. This feels more complicated than it should be. I listened without correcting. There's a temptation in moments like that to step back in, to offer context, to restore ease. But that would have undone the boundary I had set. So I stayed where I was, present, accurate, limited. Mark, to his credit, worked hard. He filled gaps where he could, learned quickly, asked for support when necessary. He wasn't failing, but he was discovering something I already knew, that the role he had inherited wasn't just a list of tasks. It was a web of judgment calls, and judgment takes time to transfer. Leadership began to feel the drag. Not enough to question the transition, but enough to notice that things were heavier than expected. That efficiency had a cost they hadn't budgeted for. Still, no one came to me with regret, because regret requires recognition, and recognition was still inconvenient. What they were experiencing wasn't punishment. It was reality, unfiltered by my quiet interventions. By the end of that quarter, the organization was functioning, just not effortlessly. And that difference, the loss of ease, was the first real consequence of a decision made long before anyone thought to include me. The moment they realized something was wrong didn't come with urgency. It came with discomfort. By then, the system had absorbed enough friction that people were starting to feel it personally, not as a crisis, but as fatigue. More meetings, more follow-ups, more second-guessing. Work that used to feel fluid now felt heavy. And heaviness makes people look backward. I could sense the shift in how questions were framed. Instead of, "Can you handle this?" it became, "How did we used to handle this?" Instead of, "Mark will take this forward," it became, "Who was involved when this was first set up?" Those questions circled closer to me, but never quite landed. No one wanted to say it plainly, because saying it plainly would mean acknowledging that something essential had been moved without being fully understood. There was a meeting, one I was invited to last minute, where the tone finally changed. It was framed as a process alignment discussion, neutral language, calm agenda, but underneath it was tension. A senior leader expressed concern about risk exposure. Another mentioned delays that were becoming visible externally. Someone else asked whether we had lost context during the transition. Lost context. That phrase hung in the air. I listened, took notes, spoke only when asked. When I did speak, I was careful. "Yes, that context exists," I said, but it was never formally transferred. No accusation, no emphasis, just a statement of fact. There was a pause, a longer one this time. Someone asked, "Could we reconstruct it?" That was the question, the one that revealed it was already too late, because reconstruction assumes equivalence. That memory can be rebuilt from artifacts. That judgment can be reverse engineered from outcomes. Sometimes it can. This time it couldn't, not fully, not without time, not without access to people who had already moved on, not without slowing everything down. And slowing down wasn't an option leadership wanted to consider. I could see the calculus happening in real time. The recognition paired with reluctance. The understanding paired with inconvenience. This was the moment when a fix would have required humility. And humility is expensive. Instead, the conversation shifted toward mitigation, safeguards, additional reviews, temporary controls. all solutions that treated the symptom, not the source. I understood then that no one was going to come to me and say, "We should have handled this differently." Not because they were cruel, but because the system had already adapted around the decision. Admitting error now would create instability. It was safer to move forward imperfectly than to reopen the past. After that meeting, I was asked gently whether I'd be willing to help more closely for a while. The phrasing mattered. Not lead, not reclaim ownership, just help. It was an olive branch, and also a confirmation. They didn't want me back in the role. They wanted my presence as a buffer, temporarily. I considered it carefully, and I declined. Not abruptly, not emotionally. I said, "I'm happy to clarify things as they come up, but I can't step back into a role that isn't defined." That sentence changed the dynamic. It wasn't defiant, it was final. After that, the tone shifted again, this time toward restraint. Fewer asks, more distance. The organization adjusted its expectations downward. They didn't fix the problem. They learned to live with it, and that more than anything told me the truth. When it would have mattered most to change course, they chose continuity over correction. By the time regret could have become action, action was too disruptive. Too late to fix it. Not because I refused to help, but because help was only welcome when it didn't challenge the structure. And I was no longer willing to fit myself into a structure that had already moved on without me. At that point, my path was clear. The rest was simply acknowledgement. The confrontation, when it finally happened, didn't feel like one. There was no raised voice, no list of grievances, no moment where I finally said all the things I'd been holding back. In fact, if someone had walked past the conference room, they might have assumed it was a routine check-in. It was my manager who asked for the meeting. Her tone was careful, measured in a way that suggested she already knew this wasn't going to be simple. By then, enough friction had accumulated that avoiding the conversation was no longer possible. Not because of drama, but because of drift. She started with appreciation. She always did. She talked about my history with the company, my reliability, the way I had held things together through multiple transitions. None of it was false, but it was all framed in the past tense. Then she paused. "I want to check in on how you're feeling about everything," she said. "About the changes." I didn't rush to answer. Silence has a different quality when you're no longer afraid of it. It doesn't fill itself, it waits. "I think the changes make sense for the organization," I said finally. "They've been planned for a while." Her expression flickered, just briefly. "I'm not sure we realized how that might land," she said. That was as close as it came to acknowledgement. I nodded. "I don't think anyone intended harm." And I meant it. We sat with that for a moment. Two people recognizing the gap between intention and impact without trying to collapse it. She asked whether there was anything I wanted to revisit. Any role clarification, any adjustments that might help me feel more supported. This was the opening I could have used months earlier. But timing matters more than language. "I'm clear on the role as it exists now," I said. "And I'm also clear that it doesn't align with how I want to work moving forward." There it was. No accusation, no emotion, just a boundary. She asked if I was considering leaving. I didn't frame it as a threat or a negotiation. "I'm considering what's next for me," I said. "And I don't think that next step is here." She absorbed that quietly. What struck me most in that moment was not her reaction, but my own. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't rehearsing. I wasn't hoping for reassurance. I wasn't asking to be chosen. We talked logistics after that. Timelines, transitions, how to close things cleanly. The conversation stayed calm because there was nothing left to defend. At one point, she said, "I wish we'd had this conversation earlier." I believed her, but I also knew it wouldn't have changed the outcome. Earlier, the system hadn't been ready to hear it. Now it was too late to undo what had already solidified. That's the paradox of professional conflict. By the time it becomes speakable, it's often already resolved, just not in your favor. There was no apology, no justification, no attempt to persuade me to stay. And oddly, that was a relief. We ended the meeting respectfully, cordially, almost gently. When I left the room, I didn't feel victorious. I felt clean, because the confrontation wasn't about winning or being right. It was about alignment, finally spoken aloud. And once something true is said calmly, without heat, it can't be argued with. It can only be accepted. After I left, people asked me how I felt. They expected a specific answer, relief maybe, or anger, or some polished version of closure that made the story easier to digest. The truth was quieter than that. I felt reoriented. For a long time, I had defined myself by how useful I was to a system, how much complexity I could absorb, how many problems I could solve without needing recognition. I wore that identity with pride, believing it meant I was strong. What I see now is that it also meant I was easy to overlook, not because I lacked value, but because I made my value frictionless. Leaving that role forced me to separate who I am from what I had been doing. And that separation, while uncomfortable, gave me something I hadn't had in years: perspective. I didn't rush into anything new. I took time to notice how my nervous system felt without constant background vigilance, how my thoughts moved when I wasn't tracking dependencies or compensating for blind spots, how silence felt when it wasn't tactical. I realized how much of my calm had been earned through restraint, not peace. That distinction matters. In the months that followed, I was more deliberate about where I placed my energy. I chose environments where clarity was valued over speed, where authorship mattered, where support wasn't code for self-erasure. I also changed how I show up. I still listen, still observe, still value precision. But I no longer disappear inside competence. I name my boundaries early. I clarify roles before I fill gaps. I let pauses stand without rushing to resolve them, not as a tactic, as a principle. What surprised me most was how differently people responded. When I spoke less, but more intentionally, my words carried weight. When I stopped overfunctioning, collaboration became more honest. When I didn't rush to be helpful, my contribution was more clearly defined. I hadn't become louder. I had become visible. I don't feel bitterness toward the people I left behind. Most of them are still doing what systems train us to do: optimize, streamline, move forward. They didn't fail me as individuals. The failure was structural, and I had participated in it longer than I should have. That's something I take responsibility for, because quiet dominance isn't about withholding or maneuvering. It's about knowing when your silence is service and when it's self-betrayal. Who I am now is someone who recognizes that distinction. I don't wait for permission to be included. I don't assume being needed means being respected. I don't confuse stability with alignment. And I don't confuse calm with consent. If there's a single thing this experience gave me, it's discernment. The ability to tell when something is unfolding with me and when it's unfolding around me. That awareness has changed how I move through every space since. Not harder, just clearer. There's a story we like to tell ourselves about professionalism, that if we stay composed, if we do good work, if we don't make things difficult, we'll be taken care of. Sometimes that's true, and sometimes that belief becomes the very thing that makes us easy to move around. What happened to me wasn't dramatic. No one raised their voice. No one acted with obvious malice. That's why it took so long to understand. The process was quiet, reasonable, and well-intentioned on the surface, and that's exactly why it worked. The lesson I took from this isn't that you should distrust people, or guard information, or fight for attention at every turn. It's this: clarity must be mutual. If you're the one holding continuity, you deserve to know where that continuity is leading. If you're being asked to mentor, support, or stabilize, you deserve to understand how that role evolves and whether it includes you in the future it's building. Silence can be strength, patience can be wisdom, but when silence is used to avoid discomfort rather than to observe truth, it slowly erases you. Quiet dominance isn't about outplaying anyone. It isn't about waiting for others to fail, and it isn't about being indispensable. It's about choosing alignment over approval. I didn't win anything by leaving. I didn't prove a point. I didn't teach anyone a lesson. What I did was stop participating in a story where my voice wasn't needed, but my labor was. And that choice gave me something far more valuable than vindication. It gave me authorship. If you're listening to this and something feels familiar, not identical but emotionally recognizable, I hope you take this not as a warning, but as permission. Permission to ask earlier. Permission to name patterns without dramatizing them. Permission to step back when your silence starts costing you more than it gives. Because the most powerful shifts don't announce themselves. They happen the moment you stop waiting to be seen and start deciding where you belong. I'd really like to hear from you. Have you ever realized, a little too late, that a transition was happening around you without your consent?